I want to ask you something that might make you a little uncomfortable. And I am asking it because I think the answer reveals something that most people in the manifestation space completely overlook. Something that has been shaping your vibrational frequency every single day, often in direct contradiction to everything you are consciously trying to create. What words do you use when you talk about your financial situation? Not what you think about it, not what you feel about it in a general sense. The actual words. The specific language you reach for automatically when you describe where you are financially, to other people, and more importantly, to yourself in the quiet of your own mind. Do you call your financial situation a struggle? A mess? A disaster? Do you tell yourself you are broke, that you are always behind, that money is tight, that you cannot afford things, that financial freedom is something other people get to have? Do you describe financial setbacks as devastating, as proof that things never work out, as evidence that the life you want is further away than ever? Because here is what I want to offer you today, something that completely reframed my understanding of why my manifestation practice was producing inconsistent results for so long, and why the shift that finally made the biggest difference was not another visualization technique or a new approach to affirmations, but something far more immediate, far more accessible, and far more constantly active than either of those things. Your words are your vibration, not a metaphor for your vibration. Not a reflection of your vibration after the fact. Your words, the specific language you choose to label your experience, moment by moment, thought by thought, conversation by conversation, are actively generating your frequency in real time. They are the most immediate, most constantly available instrument you have for shaping the signal you are broadcasting, and most people using the law of attraction are paying almost no attention to them. Neville Goddard understood this with a precision that I find remarkable. He taught that the word is not just a description of what you believe, it is the medium through which your belief expresses itself, and therefore the medium through which your reality is created. The words you use are not reporting on your inner state, they are constructing it. And from that constructed inner state, your external reality is generated. Tony Robbins came at this from a completely different angle, through research, through neuroscience, through years of direct work with thousands of people, and arrived at something remarkably similar. He calls it transformational vocabulary, and the core insight is this. The word you choose to label an emotion does not just describe the intensity of that emotion, it determines it. Change the word and you literally change the physiological experience in your body, the chemistry, the nervous system response, the felt sense of the emotion itself. These two frameworks, one rooted in consciousness and the spiritual mechanics of creation, one rooted in neuroscience and the psychology of performance, point to exactly the same truth from completely different directions. And together, they reveal something about the relationship between language and manifestation that I think is one of the most underutilized and most immediately impactful insights available to anyone genuinely trying to create a different financial reality. I remember the period in my own financial journey when I first started paying serious attention to my own financial language, and what I discovered was genuinely startling. Not because my language was particularly dramatic or extreme. It was not. It was ordinary. Everyday. The kind of financial language that most people use without a second thought. Words like stuck, tight, hard, limited, behind, not enough. None of those words felt extreme when I was using them. They felt accurate. Realistic, like an honest description of where things stood. But when I started seeing them through the lens of what Neville and Robbins were both pointing to, when I understood that those words were not just describing my financial frequency, but actively generating it, something shifted in how I related to my own language in a way that produced changes faster than almost anything else I had tried. By the end of this conversation, I am going to share the specific word shift that produced the most immediate and most surprising change in my own financial reality. It was so simple that when I first encountered it, I almost dismissed it. And I am glad I did not. But first, I want to make sure you genuinely understand the mechanism, because once you see exactly how words shape emotional and therefore vibrational reality, the practice that follows is going to make complete sense rather than feeling like one more positive thinking technique layered on top of everything else. If you are new here, hit subscribe and grab the free PDF on equal hours and their meanings linked in the description. Let's go deeper. So let's get into the specific mechanism, because I think understanding exactly how this works is what separates this conversation from the usual just think positive advice that most people have heard so many times it has stopped landing with any real force. Tony Robbins describes something in his work that I find both scientifically fascinating and immediately practically useful. He calls it the emotional label effect. And the core insight is this. When you attach a word to an emotion, you are not just naming something that already exists at a fixed intensity. You are actively shaping that intensity through the label you choose. The word is not a passive descriptor. It is an active constructor. He illustrates this through a story that I think captures the principle more vividly than any abstract explanation could. He was in a business meeting with two colleagues when they discovered that someone they had been negotiating with had essentially tried to take advantage of them. All three people experienced the exact same situation at the exact same moment. Same information, same betrayal, same objective circumstances. But what happened next was completely different for each of them. The first colleague went completely sideways. His face flushed, his voice rose. He kept repeating over and over that he was furious, that he was enraged, that he could not believe this had happened. His entire physiology transformed. He looked like someone who was genuinely on the edge of losing control. The second colleague barely reacted. When asked how he felt, he said simply that he was a little annoyed. And when the first colleague challenged him, almost offended that his reaction was so measured, the second said that for him to feel truly furious, something significantly worse would have to happen. Same situation, completely different emotional realities. Not because one person was naturally more or less emotional than the other, but because the words they chose to label the experience actively shaped the intensity of the experience itself. Robbins took this observation and began testing it deliberately. He started experimenting with consciously changing the words he used to describe his own emotional states, particularly in moments of frustration, stress, or difficulty. And what he found, consistently, was that the word change produced an immediate physiological change. Not a gradual shift over time, an immediate one. The moment he replaced a high-intensity negative label with a lower-intensity one, the emotion itself recalibrated to match the new label. He tells a story about arriving at a hotel after a long flight, exhausted, only to discover his reservation had not been properly made. He could feel the familiar activation of anger beginning to rise. And instead of labeling it the way he normally would, instead of saying to himself or to the hotel staff that he was getting angry or frustrated, he deliberately chose a different word. He told the receptionist that if the situation was not resolved soon, he might start to feel a little peeved. And something remarkable happened. The word was so unexpected, so much lighter than the emotional charge of the moment, that it actually broke the pattern. The receptionist smiled. Robbins felt the physical intensity of the rising anger simply dissolve. The situation was resolved quickly and with good humor on both sides. The word changed the experience. Completely. In real time. Now, I want to take this directly into the financial domain, because this is where I think the implications are most significant and most immediately applicable for anyone working with the law of attraction. Think about the words most people use to describe their financial situation when it is not where they want it to be. Devastating, hopeless, a disaster, a mess, impossible, drowning, trapped. These are the words that come automatically, not because people are being deliberately dramatic, but because they are reaching for the label that feels most accurate to the intensity of what they are experiencing. But here is what Neville Goddard understood about this that goes even deeper than Robbins' psychological framework. Every word you speak, internally or externally, is an act of creation, not a description of a creation that already exists. An act of creation happening in real time. When you say, "I am drowning financially," you are not reporting on your financial state. You are actively generating the vibrational frequency of drowning and broadcasting that is the signal from which your next financial experience will be drawn. Neville was absolutely precise about this. He taught that your assumptions, your deeply held beliefs about yourself and your reality, harden into fact through the words you use to express them. And the internal word, the silent language of your own thoughts, is the most powerful of all, because it operates continuously, without the filter of social awareness, expressing your truest assumptions about what is real and what is possible for you. I spent years in the financial and insurance world using a very specific set of words about my own financial situation and my own financial potential. Words that felt accurate, that felt grounded, that felt like the responsible, realistic assessment of someone who understood how money and markets actually worked. Words like limited upside, manageable risk, realistic expectations, practical constraints. And what I eventually understood through both Robbins' framework and Neville's teaching was that those words were not just describing my financial reality. They were generating it. Every time I reached for practical and realistic as my highest aspiration, I was broadcasting the frequency of limitation. And the law of attraction, operating with complete impersonal precision, was delivering experiences that matched that frequency with remarkable consistency. The financial ceiling I kept returning to was not a market reality. It was a language reality. It was the upper boundary of what my habitual financial vocabulary was capable of generating. Now here is the piece that I find both surprising and immediately actionable. The specific discovery about what happens when your emotional vocabulary is limited. Because I think this is the missing link that explains why so many people do genuine manifestation work and still find themselves cycling through the same limited range of financial experience. And that is exactly where we are going next. So now we understand the mechanism. Words are not passive descriptions of emotional reality. They are active constructors of it. The label you choose shapes the intensity of the experience, which shapes the frequency you broadcast, which shapes what you attract back into your financial life. But there is a layer underneath this that I think is even more important, and that Robbins identified through his research in a way that I found genuinely startling when I first encountered it. Most people are operating with a profoundly limited emotional vocabulary, not because they are unintelligent or uneducated, but because the range of words most people actually use in their daily inner dialogue, the words they reach for automatically when labeling what they feel, is surprisingly narrow. And that narrow vocabulary creates a correspondingly narrow range of emotional and vibrational states, which creates a correspondingly narrow range of what they are capable of attracting. Here is what I mean by that practically. Think about the words most people use when something good happens financially. Things are okay. Not bad. Pretty good. Fine. Decent. Going all right. And now think about the words the same people reach for when something goes wrong financially. Devastating. Horrible. A nightmare. Catastrophic. Unbearable. A disaster. Do you notice the asymmetry? The negative end of most people's emotional vocabulary is extraordinarily rich, detailed, varied, nuanced, with dozens of gradations from mildly uncomfortable all the way to completely catastrophic. The positive end, for most people, is remarkably impoverished. Good, great, nice, fine, okay. Robbins discovered through research that this asymmetry is not accidental. In the English language, there are significantly more words available to describe negative emotional states than positive ones. More than twice as many, in fact. Which means that the linguistic infrastructure we have all been given to navigate our emotional lives is structurally biased toward the negative. We have been handed a vocabulary that makes it far easier to be precise about suffering than about joy, far easier to articulate limitation than abundance, far easier to inhabit and communicate states of lack than states of genuine flourishing. And because words are the medium through which emotional states are constructed and sustained, this linguistic asymmetry translates directly into a vibrational asymmetry. Most people have a much wider, much more easily activated, much more physiologically intense range of negative vibrational states available to them than positive ones. Not because their lives are predominantly negative, but because their vocabulary has trained them to inhabit negative states with far more precision and depth than positive ones. Think about what this means for manifestation. If the positive vibrational states you are capable of generating, the frequencies from which you attract abundance, opportunity, and financial expansion, are limited to okay, pretty good, and not bad, while your negative vibrational states run the full spectrum from mildly concerned all the way to complete catastrophe, which end of that range is going to dominate your energetic output across an average day? The answer is almost always the negative end, not because you are a negative person, but because you have been handed a richer, more varied, more immediately accessible vocabulary for navigating that territory. And here is the piece that I found most personally confronting when I truly absorbed this. This vocabulary asymmetry is not just something that lives inside you. It is something you absorbed from the people around you. The language of your financial reality, the specific words that became automatic when describing money, opportunity, struggle, and abundance, came primarily from the environment you grew up in and the people you spent the most time with. I think about my own professional environment during my corporate years. The financial and insurance world has a very specific vocabulary, one built around risk management, conservative projections, realistic expectations, downside protection. It is a vocabulary designed to prevent overconfidence and manage loss, and there is real value in that. But it is also a vocabulary that, when applied to your own relationship with abundance and possibility, functions as a profound limiter. Every time I reached for that professional vocabulary to describe my own financial situation and potential, I was applying a risk management frame to my own life, and wonder of wonders, I kept generating results that looked like someone who was very successfully managing downside risk rather than someone who was genuinely open to upside possibility. The language of my environment had become my internal language, and my internal language had become my vibrational output, and my vibrational output had become my financial reality. This is what Neville Goddard meant when he said that the assumptions you accept about yourself harden into fact. The financial vocabulary you have inherited from your family, your professional environment, your peer group, the cultural conversation around money that you have been swimming in your entire adult life is not neutral. It carries a vibrational charge. And if that vocabulary is predominantly oriented towards scarcity, limitation, and risk rather than abundance, expansion, and possibility, it does not matter how many visualizations you do or how many affirmations you repeat. The ambient language of your inner life is broadcasting a signal that is working against everything you are consciously trying to create. I experienced this most clearly during a period in my transition out of the financial world when I started deliberately paying attention to the language of the people I was spending the most time with. And what I noticed was striking. The people in my immediate professional environment spoke almost exclusively in the language of constraint. What was not possible? What was too risky? What was unrealistic? Why the conservative approach was always the wise one. And I had been absorbing that language so completely, for so long, that it had become my own internal voice without me ever consciously choosing it. The moment I started deliberately seeking out different language, through the books I was reading, the conversations I was having, the way I was choosing to describe my own situation, even when it felt slightly unfamiliar and slightly aspirational, something began to shift in my vibrational baseline that no amount of visualization practice had been able to produce on its own. Because the visualization was happening for 20 minutes each morning. The language was happening all day long. And all day long always wins. Which brings us to the most practical and most immediately applicable part of this entire conversation, what actually building a transformational financial vocabulary looks like in practice, and the specific word shifts that made the most immediate difference in my own experience. That is exactly where we are headed to close this out. So here we are at the part that turns everything we have covered into something you can actually begin using today, not as a concept to think about, as a practice to live. I want to start with something that I think is important to say clearly before we get into the specifics. Building a transformational financial vocabulary is not about toxic positivity. It is not about pretending your financial situation is something it is not, or plastering cheerful language over genuine difficulty in a way that feels hollow and disconnected from reality. Neville Goddard was very clear about this distinction. The goal is not to deny what is. The goal is to choose words that do not amplify what is beyond its actual significance, and to develop language that opens the door to what could be, rather than language that locks it shut. There is a difference between honest and heavy, between accurate and amplifying, and that distinction is where the real practice lives. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like in my own financial life, because the specific word shift I promised you at the beginning of this conversation is almost embarrassingly simple, and yet the effect it produced was immediate and measurable in a way that surprised me. For years, when my financial situation was not where I wanted it to be, my automatic internal language was some version of stuck. I am stuck. Things are stuck. My income is stuck. And stuck is an extraordinarily heavy word. It carries a physiological weight, a felt sense of immobility, of being held in place by something outside your control, of effort without movement. Every time I used that word internally, I was generating the vibrational frequency of a person who could not move. And not surprisingly, movement was exactly what I was not experiencing. The shift was simply this. I stopped using the word stuck and replaced it with in transition, not because the external circumstances had changed, but because in transition carries a completely different energetic signature. Transition implies movement. It implies that where you are right now is not a permanent state, but a passage between one chapter and the next. It implies that the current experience has a direction and a destination, rather than being an endpoint. The first time I made that substitution consciously, the first time I caught myself about to say stuck and chose in transition instead, something shifted in my body that I can only describe as a loosening. A subtle but unmistakable physical release of the held, braced quality that the word stuck had been generating. And from that slightly more open internal state, I made a financial decision that week that I had been hesitating over for months. Not because the external circumstances had changed, because my internal frequency had shifted just enough to make the decision feel possible rather than risky. That is the power of a single word change. And once you experience it once you feel the immediate physiological difference between a word that contracts and a word that opens, you cannot unsee it. You become acutely aware of the language you are using all day long, in a way that makes the practice feel less like discipline and more like a constantly available tool. Here are some of the specific word substitutions that I have found most impactful in the financial domain. Not as a definitive list, your own language will have its own patterns that are worth discovering, but as a starting point for what this practice can look like in real life. Instead of, I cannot afford this, I am currently choosing to invest my resources differently. The first version broadcasts scarcity and limitation. The second broadcasts agency and intentionality, a completely different signal from a completely different vibrational place. Instead of I am struggling financially, I am navigating a financial transition. Again, the first version amplifies the difficulty and makes it feel permanent. The second acknowledges the reality honestly while keeping the door to movement open. Instead of money is tight, I am in a period of focused financial building. This one reframes the same objective circumstance as intentional and directional rather than constrained and reactive. Instead of, I will never get ahead, I am consistently moving toward financial freedom. This substitution is particularly important because never is one of the most vibrationally dense words in the financial vocabulary. It forecloses all possibility with a single syllable and broadcasts it as absolute truth. And perhaps most importantly, instead of I do not deserve abundance or I am not the kind of person who has financial freedom, I am becoming someone whose relationship with money reflects my truest potential. This one draws directly from Neville's teaching. You are not reporting on a fixed identity. You are choosing the identity your words are actively constructing. Now, I want to bring in Neville's deeper point about the internal word because I think it completes this framework in a way that makes the practice genuinely transformative rather than just a linguistic exercise. Neville taught that your inner speech, the silent, continuous conversation you are having with yourself about yourself and your reality, is the most powerful creative force available to you. More powerful than your spoken words, because it operates without the social filter that sometimes causes people to moderate their language in public while their internal dialogue remains completely unchecked. What you say to yourself in the privacy of your own mind about your financial situation, your financial identity, and your financial future, that is what is generating your vibrational output most consistently and most powerfully. And this means that the practice of transformational vocabulary is not primarily about what you say to other people. It is about what you say to yourself, the words you use in your own mind when you look at your bank account, the language you reach for automatically when a financial setback occurs. The internal narrative that runs in the background of your financial life, describing, labeling, and therefore constructing your experience of it. That internal narrative is where the real work is, and it is also where the most immediate results are available, because you cannot always control what happens in your external financial world, but you have complete access in every single moment to the words you choose to use about it. Here is the practical invitation I want to leave you with. For the next 7 days, I want to invite you to become an honest observer of your own financial language, not to judge it, not to force it into something artificial, just to notice. Every time you catch yourself using a word to describe your financial situation, internally or externally, pause for just a moment and ask, is this word opening a door or closing one? Is this the most accurate description of reality? Or is it an amplification of difficulty that is generating more energetic weight than the situation actually requires? And when you find a word that is closing doors, that is generating the frequency of limitation, scarcity, or impossibility, see if you can find a word that describes the same reality honestly, but from a slightly more open, slightly more directional, slightly more possibility-oriented place. You do not have to force yourself to feel what you do not feel. You do not have to pretend the difficulty is not real. You just have to be willing to ask whether the word you are reaching for is the most useful one available, or whether there is another word that tells the truth about where you are while keeping the door open to where you are going. Because as Neville Goddard said, and as Tony Robbins confirmed from a completely different direction, the word you choose becomes the world you experience. And you are choosing every single moment, whether you know it or not. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this video. It truly means the world to me, and I hope this conversation brought you something real, something you can carry with you starting today. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. We have so much more to explore together. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. You never know whose life you might change with a single video. The books that have shaped my journey and that I personally recommend are all linked in the description below. Go check them out. They are worth every page. And don't forget, there is a free PDF in the description on equal hours and their meanings. Grab yours. It is completely free, and it might just change the way you see the signs the universe has been sending you all along. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.